Hello, everybody, and welcome to Tip of the Iceberg Live, your home for Pittsburgh Penguins news and analysis throughout the season and off-season. Remember, you can find us on YouTube at Inside the Penguins or anywhere you get your podcast from. Got a good show for you guys today on the docket. Thank you to everybody that has joined on the live stream. We'll answer all of your questions at the tail end of this episode, so make sure you drop them in the comments section below. But have a couple of things I want to talk about before we get to it. And let's start with the top trade destinations for Riley Smith. It's the top story for today's episode. It's the top discussion for a lot of trade talk surrounding the Pittsburgh Penguins this offseason. Riley Smith's first year in Pittsburgh, it didn't go great. The Penguins acquired him for a third-round pick in what seemed to be a really solid move from Kyle Dubas, bringing in a bona fide Stanley Cup champion with a consistent goal-scoring pedigree and an opportunity to aid in their transition game and their scoring off the rush. Well, at the end of the day, he ended with 40 points on the season, 13 of them being goals in 76 games. The rush offense that he brought was a little bit different than the Penguins had seen in years prior, but at the end of the day, they still finished as one of the worst teams in scoring off the rush in the National Hockey League, and Smith himself finished with his lowest point per game output since the 2021-22 season. He finished the year on the Penguins' third line after being demoted through the first line, and the second line just didn't fit with either Sidney Crosby or Evgeny Malkin for the majority of the season. He finishes with Lars Eller and Valtteri Puustinen, and while, yes, certain times that line looked pretty good for the Penguins, most times it was due to Lars Eller and Valtteri Puustinen pushing the play forward. And you also don't want to spend $5 million on Riley Smith just to play on that third line. So with 1 year left in his contract, it's believed that he could be on the trade market this summer, that Kyle Dubas could look to shop the veteran forward with about 1 year left, $5 million on his contract, and in hopes that he opens up that roster spot and opens up a little bit of salary cap space to change things for the Penguins heading into next season. So who could the Penguins look to offload his $5 million to? I think there's two teams that make the most sense right off the bat. First and foremost, it's the Anaheim Ducks. Plenty of cap space for the Ducks. Not only that, they're looking for players that bring that 200-foot game. Pat Verbeek, the new general manager, wants that all-around aspect of hockey. He doesn't just want high-flying offense with no need to pay attention to the defense. He wants players that are going to be able to play that 200-foot game, be able to play that hard-nosed style of game that really you need to succeed in the Western Conference, and you need to succeed specifically in the Pacific Division. And look at how brutal that Vancouver Canucks and Edmonton Oilers series is becoming. Look at how the Vegas Golden Knights bullied their way to a Stanley Cup championship last year. Look at a little further back, the St. Louis Blues and what they had to be and become to get to the Stanley Cup championship and the Stanley Cup final out of the Western Conference. They need to be teams that are not just stellar offensive teams, but teams that are defensively responsible as well. Riley Smith fits that mold, and that's why I think he would be a good fit for the Anaheim Ducks. Not only that, the Ducks are looking to finally climb out of that rebuild. They have the young stars to surround Riley Smith, to surround a guy like Troy Terry, who's a little bit older at this point. They have their Mason McTavishes. They have a guy in Cutter Gauthier that's going to bring a lot of talent and be a good young piece for them. They need some veterans on that roster. They need some veterans in that lineup. And I think Riley Smith to the Anaheim Ducks would be one move that you could potentially see happening. The other team I'll mention in the Eastern Conference, the Buffalo Sabres, another young team looking to take that next step. They could reunite Riley Smith with former Vegas Golden Knights teammate Alex Tuch, and they could form the veteran side of that Buffalo Sabres team. They're looking to bring in, the end of a 13-year playoff drought, the longest playoff drought in North American sports. They had a coaching change, bringing in Lindy Ruff, and I think Lindy Ruff and Riley Smith would fit as a good coach and forward combination there. So Anaheim, Buffalo, those are the two teams that I would say, if you're looking to move on from Riley Smith, and there's a good chance that Kyle Dubas is, those are the two teams that go to the top of my list immediately as potential landing spots for the 31-year-old, 32-year-old veteran forward who has some offensive upside. He just wasn't able to make it work with the Pittsburgh Penguins. So once again, Riley Smith, the Pens are looking to move on from him. He has 1 year left at $5 million. Anaheim, Buffalo, those are the teams I'm keeping an eye out for. Let's talk about the biggest storyline and the biggest news story revolving around the Pittsburgh Penguins over the last week. I've talked about it a couple different times on this platform, and that's the Penguins re-signing forward Valtteri Puustinen. Now, Puustinen is only going to be 25 years old at the start of next season. He gets a 2-year contract worth $775,000 over the next 2 years at the National Hockey League level. You would assume that he ends up starting the year, or at the very least is in pole position to start the year on the NHL roster for the first time in his career. The former seventh round pick, I should say, for the Penguins in the 2019 draft. I think he's going to be looked at as an important piece next season. They're going to need him to break out in a similar way that Drew O'Connor did, be able to put the pieces together and become that everyday NHLer that he's looking to become. Now, he did have a really good welcome to the NHL season his rookie year this year. He had 20 points in 52 games, but the Penguins are going to need more than that from him going into next season, specifically on the goal scoring side of things. Only 5 goals in his first year, a couple of them against the New York Islanders. If he's going to pick a team to be able to terrorize, at least it's a team within the division that the Penguins are going to see a handful of times and not somebody in the Western Conference who they'll only see twice. But they need that goal scoring to emerge from a guy in Valtteri Puustinen who has all the intangibles. He has the shot selection. He has the ability to fire it past guys. He has really solid accuracy on his shot. And also, he's a guy that you started to see towards the end of this season was able to find the soft spots in the zone, something that Jake Gensel made a habit of early in his career. If Puustinen can really perfect that in his craft, he might be able to bump up and be an everyday top sixer, maybe not a bona fide top 6 guy that could be a top 6 on every team, but somebody that could play alongside Crosby and Malkin for extended periods of time and be able to light the lamp and fill up the score sheet a lot more than he was able to this season. But we'll have to wait and see what he's able to do. Obviously, currently playing over in Czechia for Team Finland. He hasn't had the greatest start to the tournament. No points in 3 games for him, which brings us to the update on the IIHF World Championship Tournament. With Puustinen struggling a little bit, at least to light the lamp for Finland, it's good to see somebody else lighting the lamp for Finland, and that's Jesse Puljujärvi. Puljujärvi's in an interesting spot for the Pittsburgh Penguins this season because he had that half a year coming off of that double hip resurfacing surgery. He looked good for the most part, but he struggled to stay within the lineup. Now, was that because he was still dealing with something? As far as the Penguins are concerned, they've alluded to the fact that he was completely healthy towards the end of the season. So those healthy scratches were more so for other reasons. Who knows what they could be? Mike Sullivan and Kyle Dubas probably the only two that could answer that question as of right now. But Puljujärvi is somebody that with that extra year on his contract, it'll be interesting to see where they view him as the preseason begins. Do they see him as a middle 6 guy right off the bat, or do they see him as somebody that's going to have to battle with the likes of Puustinen and Vasily Ponomarev and Ville Koivunen and Sam Poulin? Is he somebody that's going to have to earn his role on this Penguins team next year? That's going to be one of the bigger storylines, at least as of right now and as of this moment, as the summer progresses. Now, for Team Finland, 1 goal, 2 assists in 3 games, and Finland is having a decent start to their World Championships. 2-0-1 record, with the 1 loss being an overtime loss. I believe it was 1-0 in their opener. Now, let's look at some of the other to the World Championships over in Czechia. None better than Erik Karlsson. You know, a lot of talk this week about Erik Karlsson, where he stands, how people believe the Erik Karlsson trade may or may not have affected the Penguins short and Sweden, leading them with 5 points in 3 games. Sweden is undefeated and looking like one of the favorites to take home gold in the World Championships, at least through the opening week of this tournament. So a good start for Erik Karlsson. Marcus Pettersson also notched a goal a couple of days ago, has a couple assists to go with it. So the Penguins for Team Sweden certainly looking stellar. For Team Canada, Michael Bunting, 1 goal, 3 assists. He's playing right now in Canada's preliminary matchup, so he might have even more, even though he was demoted from the first line alongside Connor Bedard to the 4th line for today's matchup. He still picked up an assist, and he's still having himself a pretty solid World Championships over there. So a good sign for Michael Bunting to continue to play the way that he has, at least carry over the way that he was able to play at the end of the season for the Pittsburgh Penguins, and can keep that momentum rolling into the summer. And the last thing I'll mention about World Championships, not a good update for goaltender Alex Nedeljkovic. He got his first action at World Championships yesterday in a start for Team USA against Slovakia, and he gave up 4 goals on 16 shots being pulled. In relief late in the game, USA was able to storm back, tie things up, but fell short in overtime. And my gold medal prediction for Team USA is not looking great as of right now. And Alex Nedeljkovic didn't look great in his first piece of action. We'll see if he gets the net again at some point during this tournament, but not a good start for Alex Nedeljkovic, who joined the team a little bit later. It was his first action since the season ended about 3 weeks ago, at least first game action since 3 weeks ago. So maybe that has something to do with it. But at the end of the day, not a stellar showing for Alex Nedeljkovic in his Team USA debut for the 2024 World Championship. So you look at Erik Karlsson having a great World Championships. You look at Michael Bunting having a great World Championships. Pettersson is looking really good. And you just say, hopefully these guys can come back to Pittsburgh, carry over that momentum, and have a really, really solid start to next season. Now, I'm going to circle back because some people are joining late here. I want to touch on the 2 trade destinations that I mentioned for Riley Smith. You can always, of course, rewind, but I did mention that if the Penguins are looking to move on from Riley Smith, the 2 teams I'm looking at, the Anaheim Ducks and the Buffalo Sabres, both have young cores. Both are looking to end some playoff droughts. In the Buffalo Sabres case, it is the longest playoff drought in North American sports. And you look at what those 2 teams need. They need some veterans that have that 200-foot game and they're going to be able to help on the score sheet. Smith fits the mold for both of those 2 teams. So that's the answer there for Michael. Skoden says the Panthers as we transition into our listener questions here to close out this show. So if you have a question, make sure you throw it in the comment section. We'll try to answer it here before we say goodbye on this one. The Florida Panthers are an interesting team. Unfortunately, as we talked about earlier today on the tip of the iceberg, they are in a cap situation. They're not going to be able to take on a $5 million piece in Riley Smith. And honestly, I don't know if they're going to want to. You look at what they already have on the books. Eetu Luostarinen is already due a pay increase due to his contract extension. The same goes for, let me scroll up here through this morning's notes to make sure I get the right names here. Same goes for Gustav Forsling. He got a pay increase as well. They also need to re-sign Brandon Montour. They also need to re-sign Sam Reinhart. They also need to re-sign Anton Lundell. So while he does have history with the Florida Panthers, I just don't see that as a fit simply because the Florida Panthers already have way too much on their books. I don't think they're going to be able to take $5 million. And I don't think a guy in Kyle Dubas is looking to retain on that deal with 1 year left to go. Let's go to some more of these questions. The first one I saw jumping into the comment section was Gunnar Murphy, who asks, do you think Jonathan Quick is a realistic target as a backup, or do you think the Rangers are going to lock him down? How would you feel about potentially signing him as a backup? Jonathan Quick, heading into this season, there were a lot of questions about how much does he have left. He signed with his favorite or his hometown team and the New York Rangers, a team that we kind of all saw him going to, and he had himself a resurgent season. Igor Shesterkin struggled early in the year, and the Rangers really relied on Jonathan Quick to be able to get the job done, and that's a major reason as to why they walked away with the President's Trophy. Now, of course, Shesterkin gets back on his horse. It looks like Jonathan Quick is on the back burner unless Shesterkin really starts to fumble the bag. I don't hate the idea, but I also don't know if that's where the Penguins are going to end up going, because I'm not all that convinced that they're comfortable with Tristan Jarry as their starter. Not to mention the fact that, let me look it up really quickly. I don't know how much Jonathan Quick is making, but the Penguins aren't going to be able to afford a really expensive backup goaltender. And Jonathan Quick, with 1 year at $1.3 million, 1 year, $925,000 this season, I'm not exactly sure if the Penguins are going to get the same discount that he was giving the New York Rangers. Not to mention, if you're the Rangers, why are you letting him walk? And if you're Jonathan Quick and you liked playing there and you want to win another Stanley Cup, why would you walk? Now, of course, if he wins a Stanley Cup this year, maybe he walks because he can get more money somewhere else, but I'm not sure that position is going to be in Pittsburgh. I like Jonathan Quick. I think it would be certainly interesting to see him join the Penguins, but I also don't know if that's the type of guy that they're going for. I feel like they're going to go for more of a 1B lower name that could, if need be, drop to the AHL if Joel Blomqvist is ready, because that is a huge, huge factor in what the Penguins do in the goaltending situation this year is how do they view Joel Blomqvist? Is he a guy that they view as an NHL-ready commodity, or do they view him as somebody that's going to start the year in the AHL and might potentially progress to be an NHL starter or backup or starter at some point next season? Marking Play says, I think they should trade Erik Karlsson for Thomas Chabot and Mike Matheson. I don't personally. I don't also think that either of those teams, the Senators or the Montreal Canadiens, would particularly be open to that trade as well. I think Karlsson, after 1 year in Pittsburgh, is going to have a much better second season. Not only that, I think that the Penguins are going to, at least this offseason, give him some better options when it comes to players who could potentially finish the opportunities that he creates. They didn't have the right players to finish those opportunities this year, and his numbers suffered as a result. So I see what you mean. I know a lot of people are upset with Erik Karlsson. I don't think a straight up trade for Chabot or Mike Matheson is in the cards. I think that's a little too close to playing NHL 24 and not actually looking at moves that could be made within the NHL. I just don't see a big player for player trade like that happening, especially three players that mimic each other's game in Karlsson, Chabot, and Mike Matheson. Let me look at some of these other questions here. Team Crusade says Smith to Nashville in a three-way trade to get Saros. I'm not exactly sure where the Nashville Predators are with UC Saros. As early as last offseason, they were potentially looking to move on from him because they had Yaroslav Askarov coming up in the minors, and yet they kept Saros, and he had himself a really good season, was a huge part of their resurgence in the second half of the season to get them back into a playoff spot. He is one of the bona fide goaltenders in this league, night in and night out. I'm not exactly sure if they're going to be willing to move on from him. Now, Smith to Nashville is a name that makes a little bit of sense. I looked at that when I was looking at top trade destinations for Riley Smith, but again, I just don't know what Barry Trotz is doing down there. Now, he has a couple of experienced veteran players coming off the books, Jason Zucker being one of them, so they are going to have the salary cap space to do it, but what is their goal? What are they looking to do this offseason? And does a $5 million player in Riley Smith make that much sense? Or are they going to try to do, as you probably are alluding to here, try to shut things down, break things down, and look at trying to rebuild down in Nashville? Because they've been in the middle of the pack for a while now. Ever since they lost in 2017, they've been a middle of the pack team. To get themselves out of it, they can either buy and try to get themselves up for a couple more opportunities, or they can sell and they can try to boot on next season. I'm not sure what direction Barry Trotz is going to go. I don't think that they're going to be moving on from UC Saros unless they choose to go that way. And I don't know if a three-team trade involving Riley Smith and UC Saros is something that I'd be holding my breath for. It's an interesting idea, but at the same time, I'm not exactly sure how realistic that one could be. Let's look down here at Austin's question, who asks, what kind of team would this Pens look like should we get into the playoffs next season? Would we look anything like the previous Cup teams? Now, are you referencing previous Penguins Cup teams or the last couple of Cup teams? Because I don't think the Penguins, where they're at right now, could realistically mold themselves into a Vegas Golden Knights of 2023 or a Colorado Avalanche of 2022. I just don't see that being in the cards for the Penguins. They would need to make a lot of changes for that to happen. They've done that the last two off seasons, so I'm not exactly sure how open Kyle Dubas is to turning over the lineup once again in that type of fashion. Now, if they look like the previous Penguins Cup teams, that seems a little bit more realistic, but I still think it's going to be a different way. You have to remember, those previous Penguins Cup teams had Sidney Crosby at, 31, 32 years old. Same with Evgeny Malkin and Chris Letang. These guys are older, and while, yes, their play has continued to be very good, it's different, and they need to be given different help than those Cup teams in 2016 and 2017. They don't have a Phil Kessel as of right now. Michael Bunting's a nice addition. He's similar to what you would have gotten in a Chris Kunitz, but you don't have that young Jake Gensel that I think is going to come up and instantly be a guy that has a 40-goal caliber type of resume. And he's not going to be the type of guy that's going to go out there and break rookie records in the playoffs. I do like what Braden Yeager brings to the team. If he's able to make it at the beginning of the season, or if he doesn't make it at the beginning of the season, what he's able to do if he's brought over late in the year after the Moose Jaw Warriors year next year. But I don't think they have that caliber of guy coming up. Now, I do see then potentially going young next year. And I think that's going to be the closest you're going to get, is seeing, in 2016, you had Connor Sherry, you had the emergence of a guy like Brian Rust. You might get similar looks for guys like Ville Koivunen or Vasily Ponomarev, but I also don't know what you have in those guys because they haven't played a lot in this organization yet. They're solid prospects. They're better prospects than the Penguins have had this close to the NHL in a long time, but are they going to be able to step in and fit as perfectly as those pieces did in 2016, 2017? That much can't be answered until we see how they perform and where they fit, at the very least during training camp, and at most at some point during the regular season next year. Pittsburgh Hornets asks, what's the biggest move you expect this offseason? The biggest move that is likely to me is the goaltending, because I think that is the area that Kyle Dubas is looking at and saying that it needs to be fixed this offseason. He bet big on Tristan Jarry, but he also bet big on Ryan Graves. One of those two moves, if he keeps them both for year two and they both work out, that's great, but I also don't think that's going to happen. I think if there's going to be a big move this offseason, it's going to be on the goaltending side of things. I don't know if anybody's going to take Tristan Jarry, but I do think that he's going to be on the market, and I do think Kyle Dubas is going to float his name out there and see if there's any takers and see if there's any better options for an upgrade for the Pittsburgh Penguins. Now, Team Crusade also asks, what do you think of this happening to the bottom six? Or what do you think is happening to the bottom six? Eller, Puljujarvi, Achari, Bemstrom, Puustinen, Poulin, the Gensel prospects, and Nieto. If I were to guess, Bemstrom doesn't come back, or if he comes back, it's somebody that's going to start at the AHL level. I don't know if Matt Nieto is going to get another kick at the can in Pittsburgh. He has an interesting deal. He signed a 2-year, $900,000 deal. The first year of that got burned with him being injured. The second year of that, even if he gets healthy, did the Penguins want to hold out for a spot that he didn't look that great in his 20-some games this season? Or do they want to give that chance to a younger guy, like you mentioned, a Sam Poulin, one of the Gensel prospects in Ville Koivunen, or a guy in Vasily Ponomarev? Who gets that opportunity? I don't think it's going to be Matt Nieto, especially because I know he doesn't like to do it. But man, that buyout for Nieto, 2 years, $300,000 on the salary cap. If you want to get rid of it, it's very, very easy, and it's going to cost you almost nothing to clear up that roster spot and to clear up that opportunity for some of these younger guys. He keeps saying he wants to go younger. He still has to prove that, but the amount of times that he said it, I think you see Puustinen. I think you see Puustinen a good bit. I think you see Poulin get a lot of opportunities early, and I think one of the two Gensel prospects is going to be there for a large majority of the season. Eller, you're probably best off if Eller's your fourth line center and a guy in Nola Chari is your fourth line winger. But again, there's a lot that needs to happen this offseason to determine where they're going and where they're at heading into training camp, because they still have Eller, Puljujarvi, Achari, Puustinen, Poulin, and the Gensel prospects and Nieto all under contract. Some of those are going to get moved out, if I had to guess. Some of those are going to have to battle for their position, and some of those, like Eller and Jesse Puljujarvi and Nola Chari, I think are probably here for the beginning of next season. You could probably pencil him into your lineup unless something drastic happens over the offseason. There was nothing wrong with Lars Eller. I've seen a lot of people say, you can move on from Lars Eller. Why? He was a pretty good third line center. I had no issues with him as a third line center. Did he score? Could he have scored more? Yeah, but look at what he was given. Revolving door on both sides of his wing. And he was that one constant defensive force on the bottom six. He was honestly the main constant for the Penguins' bottom six in its entirety. So I see no issue with having Lars Eller come back. I'm just saying it would be nice if you can get a little bit of an upgrade at that position and allow Eller to cook as your fourth line center. I think that would be at its best. We got a couple more questions we're going to answer here before saying goodbye. Pittsburgh Hornets asks, if Gino runs into a slump next season, do you see him staying on the second line? If he does run into a slump next season, which I think is less likely because I think they finally have somebody that plays well with him, and that's Michael Bunting. But if he does hit a slump next season, I still don't believe, if Mike Sullivan's the coach, which we all expect him to be, I still don't believe they would move him off of the second line, at least not on the pre-game graphics. They'd have him on the second line. I think if the third line is constructed a little bit better, you might see the deployment switched a little bit more. But again, that's if he runs into a slump next season. And that slump isn't going to be, hey, he's gone 4 games without a point. That slump is going to have to be substantial for Mike Sullivan to start taking him out of the lineup and taking him out of the certain rotations in ways that would make it consider that, he's not that second line center. But I think instead of actually removing him from the second line, I think if that third line is a little bit better, you could start to see their ice time start to get a little bit closer. And that's, again, only if Evgeny Malkin, his play starts to deteriorate. But again, there's a chance that he comes back out and he looks like last season's Malkin that put up 83 points in 82 games. If you get him the right line mates, crazy things can happen. The last thing I'll answer here is from Team Crusade, who says, who do you think that's the third line center and what traits do you need for that spot? My number one option this year for third line center, if they can go out and get one, is Max Domi. I like Max Domi for the same reasons that I liked Brandon Tanev earlier today when we were discussing whether or not the Penguins should bring back either Brandon Tanev or Evan Rodriguez through the trade market this year. He's gritty. He brings a little bit of that pesky side. He has that scoring ability, more so than Tanev, much more so than Tanev. And I really just think that he's somebody that can play up and down the lineup. And also, as I've said before, if you bring in a guy in Max Domi and you place him at center for the third line to start the season, and then you have a guy like Sam Poulin emerge and be able to take over that role, Max Domi can play the wing as well. You can just shift him right over to the wing and fill him in with Sam Poulin, maybe Jesse Puljujärvi on the right side. And I think it's just somebody that can really help close the gap between the top 6 and the bottom 6, because that has been a big issue for the Penguins the last couple of seasons, as there has been a very large gap between the talent and the ability of the top 6 when it comes to them versus the bottom 6. There's been a chasm between the two. I think if you get a guy like Max Domi in here, I think it helps close that gap, and it also brings a little bit more of that hard to play against, annoying to play against style that the Penguins surely are going to need more of, especially when you look around at some of the other teams in the Metropolitan Division. New York Rangers have that. The Philadelphia Flyers always have that, especially under a guy like John Tortorella. The Penguins need to start adopting that style, and I think bringing in a guy like Max Domi will really help push them towards that next season. But that is going to do it for this episode of Tip of the Ice-Burgh Live. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. We'll be back next Tuesday with more top storylines and answering more of your questions if you're here live at Inside the Penguins on YouTube. But that is it for this one. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. We'll see you next time.